Today is actually a bit of a special episode because we got a collaboration with one of my favorite YouTube channels on YouTube. It's called Eastern Roman History, and welcome to the podcast, Daniel Maynard.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, what made you start a YouTube channel dedicated to just Eastern Roman history or Byzantine history, if you will?
I think the idea for it began in my final year of university, where I've had a passion for Byzantines and Romans.
Who doesn't, right?
For quite a long time. And I had been watching a few history YouTube channels.
Right.
And I was just thinking to myself, I like how they introduce it, but they never go into the kind of detail or about the topics I would like to be able to go into. And as I was saying, because I was also doing my university undergraduate degree at the time, I was thinking perhaps it would be a good idea if I could combine kind of YouTube presentation video, a bit like other people like Kings and Generals or stuff like that, but also kind of put a academic emphasis behind it. So have use primary sources, use scholarship, use my knowledge of the field as best as I can to bring something more to the table.
But something that I love about your channel is how you are very specific with the sources that you write. That you're very specific. Like, this is a reference, this is a page, this is even the chapter where I found the source from. And I haven't seen any other YouTube channel do that, really. So I've seen, as far as I know, you're the only one who actually does that, and that is like, wow, that is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think a part of why I do it is because primary sources are the foundation of our knowledge for history. And I think that it is important to know where this information comes from. I think another onus for doing this was, I remember watching a video about the Battle of Alexander the Great's battle on the Granicus. They present the battle, but there's actually two versions of that battle in history. There's the Arian version, which is the version they use, where Alexander charges across the river and defeats the Persians. And then there's another version by a historian called Diodorus of Sicily, where Alexander the Great uses the advice of Parmenion and crosses with most of his army over to the other side of the river, and then in the morning attacks the Persians before they're aware of him being there, and removes their advantage of having the river. And it's the case of there's no preferable account. Arrian wrote at least about 500 years after the event, and Siculus, Diodorus of Sicily, wrote about 200 years. So neither one is preferable. It's like there's not a correct version. But I was thinking that if we have by showing the primary sources, you get where these things are coming from. You get more of the detail.
Now, you've been doing this for a few years already, but are you worried that because it's just Byzantine history that you do, that you will run out anytime of sort of material?
Fortunately, Byzantine history is very long. It's just from the period I like to encapsulate it, because it doesn't have a kind of finite, like a definite beginning, is from the beginning of Constantine the Great's reign in 306 to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which is 1100 years of history. That's longer than the whole history of some nations combined. And
it's
there's
longer
so
than
many
the
different periods as well.
ancient Rome as well, right?
For my channel, I prefer to do the Byzantine stuff because other channels do cover Roman things like the 3rd century crisis or Septimius Severus or people like that. Far more often. But I'm not afraid to do Roman stuff. Like a couple of years ago, I did a whole series of videos about the Emperor Augustus and how he became emperor, which was something that no one had really covered. They kind of go, well, after he defeats Antony, he becomes emperor, and there we go. But there's a whole process to it, which no one had really talked about before.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the Varangian Guard, which is Vikings in the Byzantine Empire. And I guess my first question is, how did the Vikings find out about the empire? Did they hear from others, or did they just sail into the Mediterranean and end up in Constantinople by coincidence?
Well, the Norse from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they partially in the kind of 8th and 9th century AD, the Norse start trading and they start exploring areas. They end up going to places like Russia, England, and eventually they, through this way from going from roughly where Sweden is today, through the rivers, the long rivers like the Dnipro and the places like that, through what is now Russia, and then they would go down on small ships to Constantinople, which was one of the biggest cities in Europe at the time, if not the biggest.
Yeah.
And
so they knew about Constantinople already.
Yes. Yeah, they knew about it, and it was kind of, I believe the Norse term for it is Miklagard. It's like it's the city for the Norse. They have, their towns are like small villages in comparison, where we've got several 100,000 people living in Constantinople, with the population fluctuating over the centuries. But it's just, the scale of it was far beyond anything that a lot of these Norse traders had seen or heard of before. And so it had a kind of mystique to it, and very profitable to trade. So what you have is, in the Viking Age, so for a number of reasons, which I won't go into now, but the Norse start going out and they start exploring. So you have people going up into Iceland and Greenland, like Eric the Red, but also raiding. So you have like places like in England and Paris, people like Ragnar Lothbrok going around and sacking these quite wealthy places like monasteries, and then bringing their spoils back to where they lived or settling. And for the Byzantines, this starts to occur they get their first attack in the turn of the 9th century. There's an attack on a province called the Armeniaconthene. And the Armeniaconthene, which are their army is designed to deal with attacks through the mountains by the Arabs. And so this Viking raid takes them completely by surprise, and which leads to a reform of the province to focus on the Black Sea to protect it from further raids. And although it's not often, the Vikings do come down and continue to raid the Byzantine Empire right up until 1043, which is the last one of these, what you could call a Viking raid. But the Varangian Guard, their story really is introduced in the late 10th century, in 986, during the reign of Basil II. So Basil II
So this was before.
is,
This was before Alexius, right?
yes, so Basil II, he ruled as emperor from 976 to 1025, which is about 100 years before Alexius I came to power. And he had a lot of trouble in the first 15 to 20 years of his reign. He was quite young, and he had lots of powerful lords and courtiers which he had to deal with. And these opening years are full of civil war in the Byzantine Empire. So when Basil takes power, there's a huge revolt by a man called Bardas, which he eventually manages to defeat. And then in 986, he decides to invade Bulgaria, which is a colossal disaster. And at the Battle of Trajan's Gate, most of his army is killed, and he barely escapes with his life. He basically has to fight his way through the Bulgarians to even escape their trap. So it's a huge disaster, and this leads to an immediate revolt by a man called Bardas Phocas, who is a relative of a previous emperor called Nicephorus II Phocas. And Basil II is in a bit of a fix, because he has this war with Bulgaria, which is soaking up some of the troops in the Balkans. And the troops in the east have all joined Phocas. So he doesn't have any army to face the revolt. Fortunately for him, he has an embassy of sorts with the Russian Prince of Kiev, a man called Vladimir. I think he's epitheted the Great. He's the man that converts Russia from paganism to Christian orthodoxy, which you can still see today. He strikes a deal with Vladimir so Vladimir will send Basil a large army of Varangians. So Varangians are for the Russians Norse warriors, which have taken up serving with the Russian princes, and actually had a hand helping Vladimir in his reign. So Vladimir will pass on these Norse warriors to Basil in exchange for a marriage with his sister, a woman called Anna, which was a great honor for Vladimir. And also he would convert to Christian orthodoxy. And this happens. And then in the following years, in 988, he receives these Varangians, about 6,000. And with them, he is able to crush Phocas in 2 battles and kills him. And the revolt crumbles after his death. And this is the beginning of the Varangian Guard. So these 6,000 men form the core of the imperial bodyguard, and they will continue to be in Byzantine service right up until the turn of the 15th century, when they disappear.
So was it normal for Vikings to become mercenaries and for someone else and not just raid? Was this a sort of exceptional thing?
I can't say about whether it was more general for Norse society. That's not something I know about. But it was normal for the Byzantines, the Romans, in previous ages, and also in Basil II's own day. It was very common for them to settle groups of foreigners on their territory and employ them as soldiers or sailors. This had been happening for hundreds of years. So like in the 7th century, the Emperor Justinian II, he settled a large group of Mardiites, which would be kind of something like Maronite Christians in Syria, Palestine, that area. And they were employed as sailors for 200 or so years. in the 9th century, there's a whole group called the Kuramites, which are kind of Kurdish Persian group, which en masse emigrates to the empire, and they get incorporated into the army. And also the emperor had one of their imperial bodyguards, which they had several. Varangians made up the main after Basil II, but they did have several. The Vardyriotai are a group of Hungarian settlers in Macedonia, which were employed. So it was very common for the Byzantines to have foreign units in their normal service. They weren't, the Byzantines, they were often a small part of the army. So like if the Varangian Guard were employed in a military action, they would be a elite unit as part of an army. They wouldn't be the army itself.
But is this where we get the runes inscription in the Hagia Sophia where it says Halfdan was here?
Yes. So the this comes to the two roles the Varangian Guard played for half of their history. So at first, the Varangian Guard had two roles. The first was to be employed during campaigns. So a famous military action for them was at the Battle of Beroia under the reign of John II Comnenus. So he's the son of Alexis I. The Varangian Guard were the decisive element in defeating the Pecheneg horde, which was attacking the empire at the time, because with their axes they were able to hack into the wagon fort the Pechenegs had created. Their other duty was to guard the emperor, of course. As imperial bodyguards, they would have been employed throughout the imperial palace. They had to guard the imperial reception hall, so when the emperor received visitors. The Varangian Guard were in charge of looking after the treasury. They're also employed as prison guards, torturers, and also in processions in the capital. So the emperor would always have Varangian Guards around him. They would also take part in ceremonies, in festivals, and there are instructions for what the Varangian Guard was supposed to do in these ceremonies do survive in documents. Yes, so those were the two main roles. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade, the Varangian Guard, their first function of being employed as a battlefield unit stops. There's not enough of them to field in a battlefield, but they do accompany the emperor during campaign. And often when he was on campaign and took up residence in a city, they would guard the keys of that city. So they would be in charge of his security.
So you mentioned that they were in charge of guarding the treasury, and I want to know, do you think they ever consider let's raid the treasury, get away with it, and never come back again?
Well, the trouble with that is if they did do that, the emperor would never employ them again. But actually, the Varangian Guard had a reputation for incorruptibility. They were incredibly reliable. And in fact, there is a kind of, I wouldn't say myth, but maybe a assumption that all mercenaries are unreliable. But the Varangian Guard, because they were well paid, very well disciplined, and incredibly loyal to the emperor, they had this reputation for being very reliable, very trustworthy, and also incorruptible. That's not to say that they didn't take advantage of their situation. In the late late Byzantine period. So in the 14th century, there was a story that officials visiting the imperial palace had to pay the Varangians to enter the building. But typically, the Varangians were paid well enough that they didn't need to resort to being corrupt. And actually, in the whole history of the Varangian Guard, there are only 2 instances where the Varangians actually turned against the emperor they were supposed to protect. The first was in 1042 against. There was a whole situation. One might even call it a revolution in the capital, where the Emperor Michael V deposed his mother-in-law, adopted mother, Zoe, and this annoyed everyone. And there was a whole split in the capital. There was basically a civil war in the city of Constantinople, and the Varangian Guard divided in 2 because half of them were loyal to the dynasty that had just been kicked out, and the other half were loyal to Michael V, who was also emperor. So there's that. And also the other time was in 1078, when they tried to murder Nicephorus III. They were drunk. A lot of them had been very annoyed when one of their number had been executed for murdering a prisoner, and they took it out on parade on Nicephorus III. Fortunately, the other palace guards managed to defeat them, and they were given an amnesty, and things very quickly reconciled. But those are the only 2 instances that Varangians actually turned against their master.
But how did the emperor view them? Were they considered barbarians as they were from the north, or were they just employees?
Well, they most certainly were barbarians to the emperor, but that comes under the fact that all foreigners to the Byzantine emperors were barbarians. They were the pinnacle of civilization, and anyone else was an inferior barbarian to varying degrees. But that didn't mean they didn't respect them, and incredibly so. So the Varangians, they do get lauded quite a bit in the sources. Like they're very famous. Their axes become synonymous with the Varangian Guard. So many times in the sources, they are called the Imperial Axe Bearers, or the Celtic Axe Bearers, or some variation thereof. And actually, in later centuries, when the regiment becomes largely or almost entirely composed of Englishmen, the name becomes Inglo-Barangoi, English Varangians, because they get it's almost like a very specific group, and this kind of, you can conjure it up in your mind, and of fearsome but very loyal and respected warriors that protect the emperor. So yes, they were barbarians, but they were very respected, very much a force to be reckoned with, even in Byzantine society.
So we talked a little bit about how the emperor viewed them, but how did the citizens of Constantinople view them? Did they view them with fear? Did they view them with respect or awe? And they were impressive sights to see?
A bit of fear and a bit of respect. A bit of fear because the Varangians were often tasked with doing the dirty work, so to speak. So, for instance, when Isaac Comnenus arrested the patriarch, he got his Varangian guards to do it, and they walked into the church of St. Sophia, dragged the patriarch out during mass, and hauled him off to a prison. and it also comes back to the fact that they were they're usually employed to, when they were guarding prisons, torture people. They would do that, arrest people, and so there is an element of fear. There are also these huge warriors with great big axes, and also other weapons, but fear, but also respect. That comes back to they are loyal, they are powerful, they are incorruptible.
So, was it ever an occasion that they were allowed to go back to Scandinavia, or did they serve for the rest of their lives when they were first employed as a guard?
I don't think there's one particular answer for this. So when the regiment was more Scandinavian, for those that don't know, so there are two phases for the Varangian Guard. The Scandinavian phase, when the regiment was largely composed of either Russians or Scandinavians. This is from when they were first created in the 980s under Basil II. Sorry, to the reign of Alexius I, actually, in the 1080s. Actually, the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is responsible for this, because huge numbers of Anglo-Saxons migrate to the Byzantine Empire and settle in it, and they are employed in the Varangian Guard. And very quickly, in the 12th, and then by the end of the 12th century, the entire regiment, save for a very small percentage, are Englishmen. But coming back to your point about the recruitment, so you would have bands of Scandinavians coming into the empire and then serving for a time in the guard. A good example is Harold Hardrada, who served for a period as one of the captains in the Varangian Guard, and then he goes back to Europe and becomes king of Norway. But other people, I think more with the Anglo-Saxon settlements, lived and also died in the empire. So they would have, for the English, you would have had settlements, and they would have sent people to Constantinople to take up service in the guard, done their service, and then retired. Or you would have had adventurous people coming from places like Sweden, Russia, England to take up service, and then when they'd done their service, return home. So in Sweden, where a lot of the original Varangian Guard came from, we have rune stones from Varangians that had died, as they record on the rune stones, in Greece. And so one has to ask who put up the rune stones, presumably their families or their friends. And assumably they would have gone back to them once they finished their service, or maybe even stayed in Byzantium. And we do know of people that started as Varangian Guards and then went on to either live or serve in other roles in the Byzantine Empire. So a very good example is in 1395. So this is right in the end of the Varangian Guard period, where we know that one of the universal justices of the Romans, which was a incredibly prestigious and important judicial role in the empire at that point, was filled by a former Varangian.
So I was trying to say something. Yeah, I'm referring to the Norse in Normandy right now, not the Norse in Scandinavia. But were they a threat at this point, or were they still settling in?
Well,
Because it's well known that the Norse were a threat to the Byzantine Empire.
well, the Norse refers to Scandinavia, so Sweden, Norway, Denmark. The Normans refer to the Norse. So I can understand the confusion because
I meant the Normans, yes.
But the Normans under Rollo, they settle in Normandy, and the Normans are just as adventurous as their ancestors, the Norse, because they end up getting everywhere in a sense. You've got Normans in Anatolia. The Principality of Antioch after the First Crusade is largely run by Normans. The Normans kick out the Byzantines from Italy and the Arabs from Sicily. And most famously, of course, you have the Norman invasion of England in 1066, which also ties into the history of the Varangian Guard.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I can a little bit. So 1066, what happens? So Edward the Confessor, the King of England, dies. He then has there's a power struggle for who wants to be king. You have Harold Godwinson, who Anglo-Saxon, he becomes King of England, but you also have claims from William, Duke of Normandy, and also Harold Hardrada, who had served in the Varangian Guard, also claim the throne of England through his ancestors, like Canute and so on. And Harold defeats Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in September, and then Harold is defeated by William in October. And so after that, William takes over England, and the Anglo-Saxons, a lot of nobles or people that get pushed out by William. So there's rebellions that happen against William. There's also the prince, the Anglo-Saxon prince, which is still a factor in Europe. So it's very uncertain times for the Anglo-Saxons in England, and lots of them decide to emigrate. So some of them go around Europe or join the prince in Hungary, but a large portion of them decide to go to Constantinople. And a lot of they arrive roughly right at the beginning, or in the 1070s, the Anglo-Saxons start appearing in fairly large numbers with their families and so on in the Byzantine Empire, which at this period in the 1070s is in a steep decline. It's in a complete mess. And they are allowed to settle, and they are employed in the Varangian Guard and are a huge help to Alexius I in his first years, because they provide this big source of manpower which he desperately needs during the 1080s, because he is being attacked by the Normans in Italy. He's being attacked by the Pechenegs and also the Turks, one after the other. And you almost have a replay of the Battle of Hastings between the Normans and the English in Byzantium in 1081, because at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, where the Normans, in their invasion, they crossed over from Italy to Greece and they attacked this town called Dyrrhachium, which you have to take to be able to head inland. And Alexios arrives with his army and also the Varangian Guard, which have just been imbued with large numbers of Englishmen. And the Varangians, they managed to defeat one of the wings of the Norman army and then pursue them. And then the Normans take the opportunity to catch the Varangian Guard while they're out in the open and completely destroy them.
Wow.
But they keep cropping back up. So there's obviously a lot of Scandinavians and also Englishmen which are able to top up the Varangians fairly consistently. I managed to do so for the rest of the empire's history until Varangians disappear in 1404. So we don't have exact numbers, but the amount of English which emigrate to Byzantium and are topped up over time is enough to keep the regiment as a significant elite unit for the rest of the 11th century and the 12th century, and then as a small bodyguard unit for the 200 years following the Fourth Crusade.
So how do the original Varangian Guard view the Anglo-Saxons? Do they view them as competition, or do they embrace them as they grow?
Unfortunately, we don't have exact inter-Varangian relations, but we do know that I would say that they were accommodating. And I say this because originally the Varangians who were originally coming to Constantinople, they had their own church, which was dedicated to Saint Mary and Saint King Olaf. This was in Constantinople. And this was the chapel of the regiment for the 11th century, and continued to be until the creation of another chapel for the English part of the Varangian Guard, which was dedicated to St. Nicholas and St. Augustine of Canterbury.
Are these churches still available today to be seen, or are they sacked?
I don't believe that is a good point. I believe both of them were demolished after the city had been conquered. One of them the first church to St. Mary and Olaf, this was eventually sold off by the Varangian Guard to a nunnery. So even in the Byzantine period, the first Varangian church was sold off, and they entirely moved to the second church to the Varangians, which I believe has been located. It is just a kind of remains, but it has been located in Constantinople. I think it's near the Palace of Palatinai in the northern corner of the city, which was also near where their headquarters was. And you see I think it's a good illustration of the change in the makeup of the Varangians. So you have the Scandinavians, and then they accommodate the English, and then eventually, because the regiment is almost entirely English, they just move to the one chapel.
Now, I want to know, because I don't know if this was when the Norse were pagans still, but when they became sorry if I say that wrong, Varangian Guards, do they have to convert to Christianity, or do they get to keep their paganism?
I believe, I'm afraid I don't know the exact answer. I assume they either were Christians or had to convert, at least nominally, but may have been tolerated. I'm afraid I can't give you a definite answer for that.
But Constantinople, it's well known that Constantinople was always this welcoming for other religion and refugees, right? So should have thought that they should be able to keep their religion.
Well, typically what happens is that a group will, often a non-Christian group, in many cases, will come to the empire, and then, usually because they quite like the look of it, they decide to convert to Christianity. So this was true with the Kuramites, who were like I suppose one would call it it's like a fusion. The religion they worship was a fusion between Islam and Zoroastrianism. But they all converted to Christianity after they settled in the empire. And also you did have Muslims inside the city, as well as Catholics of Constantinople, that is, and also Jews within the empire. So one can assume that perhaps they did convert to Christianity, however nominally or devotedly it was, just because the pay is good, or maybe the Varangians were very well respected. There are certain attractions to being Christian in Constantinople.
So was it like the Ottoman Empire, where if you weren't Christian, if you were Muslim, you had to pay a tax? Was it the same in the Byzantine era, that you had to pay a tax, extra tax, if you were Christian?
The Byzantines did have certain laws. Byzantine laws, not my strong point, but I do know that they did have laws, some laws against different groups. So like a Muslim couldn't become an official, or a pagan couldn't become an official. And I think it was probably a lot more of the case socially. So like the Jews in the empire were tolerated, but not liked that much. But that was probably true for most of the rest of Europe at the time. But the Romans, the Byzantines, could also have a dim view of their own subjects. So when Alexius I took the capital of Constantinople, one of the historians for his reign names his units, his troops under his control, as the Romans, which is what they called themselves, the Macedonians, and also the Paphlagonians. So the Byzantines didn't quite like some of their own provincials that much. So the fact they didn't like many foreigners settling in their empire is probably not exceptional.
No, I'm curious, when the Varangian Guard, sorry if I don't get it right for some reason, how were the laws with marriage in the Guards? Were they allowed to take marriage from, let's say, Constantinople women, or were that strictly forbidden? Were they not allowed to settle down?
It's interesting. So the Varangian Guard, we do have a lot of information about compared to other imperial bodyguards, but it's not exactly ample. But they would have had wives. So like, as I was saying with the Norse, with the Scandinavian Varangians, they would have had families either back in Sweden or places like that, or maybe had families in Constantinople that they made during their lifetime. There is an example of a Varangian who his daughter married a Byzantine doctor in Constantinople. So inter-Byzantine and Varangian relations did happen. But the regiment was also very self-contained. They did look after themselves very much. They were very respectful with the population they were dealing with, apart from the torture and prisonings and so
I'm sure
on.
they enjoyed
But
that.
that was typically imperial orders.
Mm.
But with there is an example of how the Varangian Guard kept their own justice. So the rest of the Roman army had Roman judges. The rest of the Byzantine army had judges to maintain order in the army. But the Varangian Guard seem to have had their own. There is an example where one of the Varangian Guard, a guardsman, raped a woman, and then the Varangian Guard punished this criminal by allowing the woman that he had raped to kill him, and then they gave her his property. It's an anecdote but I think it's fairly illustrative of how the Varangian Guard maintained justice and also interacted with the people in the empire.
So if they were already married, like had a Scandinavian wife, did they bring them along, or did they leave them back in Scandinavia?
I think it was. I can't say there's any evidence, but I think it would depend on the individual. So maybe you have an adventurer that goes off to fight in the Varangians, and maybe comes back after several years to his family. Or maybe he brings them with them to settle in Constantinople, like the Anglo-Saxons did. Or maybe they went to Constantinople as a bachelor and maybe made a family while they were there. All the possibilities are open, I think, on this one.
Yeah. So something I didn't get to ask in the beginning is how long time did the journey take from Scandinavia to Constantinople?
Well, typically, it would have happened by sea. So we actually have an example of not so much how long, but we can guess the rough distances between the locations. So a Varangian from Scandinavia typically would go down through Russia, along the rivers, then down into the Black Sea, and then along the Black Sea to Constantinople, and then they take up service with the emperor. Someone coming from England would probably, if they went overland, just have to walk straight there, or go to a major port, either sail around Spain and into the Mediterranean to Constantinople, or go to a port city like Venice or something, and then go from there. Or if they were in a settlement, it wouldn't have been too far away, because you just have to walk down from wherever you lived in along the Black Sea to Constantinople.
Could it take several months? Could it take weeks? A year?
It would probably be a matter of months, especially if you went with a lot of people, because of the logistics involved. So yes, it would not be overnight, but it would also be true for a lot of other people just going from place to place. They would take a lot of time.
So I want to thank you so much for coming. I think we covered the basic of the Varangian Guard.
Should we just cover the end of the regiment?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I have said how the Varangian Guard was formed. It's also important to talk about when it comes to an end. And unfortunately, we don't exactly have the Varangian Guard was disbanded then. It just doesn't exist. But the last time the Varangian Guard are mentioned is in 1404, and it's actually mentioned by a foreign source, a English or Welsh historian called Adam of Usk. He went to Rome in 1404, and he met an ambassador from Constantinople, and he told Adam that in Constantinople there were axe bearers of British race still there. So there is an inkling that they made it up to that point. And we also have other sources that refer to the Varangians, or at least indirectly to them, a few years before. So like the Emperor John VII sent a letter to Henry IV talking about the English in Byzantine service, as well as the last actual mentions by the Romans themselves to the Varangians only a few years before, in sort of like 1395, 1396, that kind of period. What happens after 1404, nobody knows. They're never mentioned again.
You don't think they were eliminated, that they were just killed off?
No. Why would you? It may have been the case. I mean, these are all guesses, but they may have just been dismissed. We can't afford you anymore because the empire in the 15th century was penniless. They may have been there, but just no one mentioned them. There is a record of 200 foreigners being in Byzantine service in the siege of Constantinople in 1453. But who those 200 foreigners are, it's anyone's guess. They could be Latins. They could even be Greeks from areas that aren't owned by the empire. So they might be included in that number, but there's no evidence to say one or the other. So we don't know. But the last time they appear is 1404.
You think it's most likely that they just went back to Scandinavia or settled elsewhere when they were done in 1404?
I don't know. I really don't know. I can't say. The trouble is, one guess is as good as the other. So.
But if I remember correctly, this was during the Black Plague as well, right?
The Black Death happened about 60 years earlier in 1347 for the Byzantines. That's when it first appeared. But no, the Varangian Guard was still in the empire right up until the end of that of the 1300s.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I want to say that before we go, this is a collaboration between Eastern and Roman history on YouTube. And this is a two-parter, and you will find a two-part on Daniel's YouTube page, Eastern Roman History, which will be up soon. And you will find the first part on my podcast and the second part on his YouTube channel. So if he says part 1 and it's a part 1 on the title and part 2 doesn't show up, the link will be in the description to Daniel's YouTube page. I highly recommend checking it out if you want to learn more about Roman history. Do you have anything else you wish to promote? Anything you wish to plug on the social media where people can find you?
Just so this first part's about the Varangian Guard, and the part I'll be doing will be about the Viking attacks on the Byzantine Empire, which I mentioned earlier in this podcast. But and I'll go into more depth and detail there. But no, I don't think so. Just I hope you'll check out some of try that again. Yep. Hope you check out Well That Happened. Well
his channel.
There. Well That Aged Well. Thank you very much. Well That Aged Well. So I've been looking at some of your podcasts, and they They're good. I've
Thank
been
you.
enjoying them.
Thank
And
you.
if you like Byzantine history, check out my channel. Perhaps you'll find something you enjoy.
It's definitely one of my favorite channels on YouTube at the moment. And next week, we will have Adrian Goldsworthy to talk about the Roman army. And this, so that will definitely be interesting. We also got an episode about Hannibal coming up. So stay tuned for those episodes. And we are on Instagram under well.h12. We are also on Stereo, which is a form of live podcast app where you can chat with us live. Where I not just interview historians, I interview anyone from porn stars to Instagram influencers to friends within comedy field. So definitely check that out. This has been well.h12. You can find part 2 on Daniel Maynard's channel, Eastern Roman History. I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening.